after our first guest tonight, Michael Montero, waiting patiently in Los Angeles. He's born in the Detroit area, based now in Los Angeles. Michael, good evening and welcome to the program.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on, man. I know I'm supposed to be on here to talk about boxing, but I'm still bummed about that Michigan game. 1 point. You talked about making shots down the stretch, man. The guys on Oregon, they just did their thing tonight.
It was a fun ride for Michigan, though, wasn't it? I mean, after the plane crash there, they win 4 straight in the Big Ten tournament, and they were kind of the feel-good story of the tournament until tonight.
Yeah, they were. 7th seed, doing what they did. Growing up, you mentioned I'm from Detroit. I grew up always pulling for Michigan. So even though I'm out here in L.A., and I'm supposed to root for the schools out here, the UCLAs, the USCs, I still quietly root for Michigan.
What was life like growing up in Detroit, Michael? Where exactly were you born and raised?
I was actually born in Mount Clemens, which is a working class area kind of northeast of town. Typical Rust Belt working class upbringing. Nothing's handed to you. You work for everything. Old fashioned in that respect. It was tough though. I saw my father get laid off a lot of times, and there were times where we needed help from the government to get by. And it got to a point where, my family said enough's enough, and they've slowly started matriculating out of Detroit. Some of them have moved down south to North Carolina. Some of them have moved out west. So it's tough, and it's had a little bit of a rebound, but, you take one step forward, you take one step back. It's a tough area.
Michael Montero, our featured guest. He has a Twitter handle and also a YouTube channel that you can find at Montero on Boxing, Montero spelled Montero. He talks, tweets, and writes about boxing a lot. His Twitter handle says he's 313 bred and 213 based. I like that. Michael, growing up in Detroit, tell us about your introduction to boxing. It's known as Hockey Town, but it's a great boxing city too.
Oh, yeah. Growing up, Thomas Hearns, the hitman, that was one of my heroes. And, Detroit is it's a big sports town in general. We grew up with, do you guys remember the Bad Boys? That's when basketball, just took a hold of the city of Detroit. When I was a kid, the Tigers won a World Series. So there's a bunch of sports. But I grew up in a boxing family. And I think a lot of times in boxing, you're kind of introduced to it, by your family. And so I just grew up around it. And moving out here to L.A. About 7 years ago, I just started hanging out at gyms and stuff like that. I've always worked out and trained and, did some amateurs and stuff like that. And, I started writing about it and just kind of worked my way up into business. And L.A. is really the gym mecca when it comes to boxing. There are over 100 gyms in this area with a lot of pros training out here. Of course, Vegas is a close proximity. That's the fight capital. That's where all the mega fights are. But all the guys are out here training now. So just going to the gyms and meeting everybody, I'm involved in the sport on a daily basis. I'm pretty much tweeting 24/7 about the goings on. It's my passion.
And we can tell. We'll ask you about that gym culture in Los Angeles. We'll ask you about the top gym here in Las Vegas as well. I believe it's Mayweather's gym, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Go back to what you said about growing up in Detroit and having boxing in your family. Who in your family was involved in the sport?
Growing up, just watching all the fights, uncles, even my grandma, we'd sit around and watch fights and the women in my family would be screaming at the TV, jab, jab, use the jab hook, So it was a family event, and my dad's going to kill me for saying this, but when Tyson started to really blow up and they, started doing fights on HBO, my family couldn't afford HBO, but my dad knew how to steal cable. So when Tyson fights would come on, he'd hook it up to where we had HBO. When you saw the cable man come on the block, he'd run outside real quick and turn it off. We'd wait for the cable man to leave the neighborhood. Boom, turn it back on. So I even saw some HBO stuff growing up. It was just a family thing. Of course, I had some relatives that were involved and trained. I did some amateurs, nothing professional. But growing up, I was bullied. I was picked on. And just to learn how to defend myself, I learned a little bit about boxing. I was a tall, skinny kid with glasses, so I got picked on a lot. It was a way for me to defend myself.
Do you think your experience in the ring helps you cover the sport now as a journalist?
Absolutely. Of course, I can't understand what it's like to be a professional and they're taking shots, but I've been in the ring enough sparring and training, and I still go on the weekends and work out, and I do some light sparring. It does give you a greater appreciation, and you see things. I can see things sometimes, the little tiny little nuances, the tiny little movements in boxing, because it's so subtle sometimes that maybe the casual fan doesn't see, especially from afar.
Michael was at Madison Square Garden last Saturday. He watched Jacobson Golovkin. We'll talk about that result in a moment. But back to the gyms in Los Angeles, the gym culture in LA. What are the leading gyms out there? Where do you visit most frequently?
Well, of course, everybody knows the Wild Card in Hollywood. Of course, that's the big one. But there are small gyms like The Rock in Carson, California. One of their fighters just fought tonight on ESPN, Jason Quigley. But they have a few guys training out of there, young prospects coming up. There's a gym up in Oxnard, California, that was headed by Robert Garcia, former trainer of the year, and now has been taken over by an advisor, Igis Klimas, who's bringing over a lot of Eastern European talent. And you have guys training out here like Vasyl Lomachenko, works out here sometimes, Alexander Usyk, of course, Gennady Golovkin. So you're getting a lot of international talent. And I think that with boxing, it's an immigrant sport. And you have a proximity here, of course, in Southern California to Mexico. You have a lot of Mexican immigrants or sons of Mexican immigrants, grandchildren of Mexican immigrants coming up in the sport, and they're growing up in these gyms here. So you just see prospects working out everywhere. And the best part of it is you get the sparring. It's the sparring in the gyms that really keeps you sharp. And when guys, sometimes you might go 6, 7, 8 months between a fight, but that sparring week after week is what keeps you sharp. So when you get up in the ring for that professional prize fight, you're a little more sharper than your opponent.
You're listening to the EOG Sports Hour. John Kelly, Vern Vivio. We're chatting with boxing journalist Michael Montero at Montero on Boxing. If you want to follow him via Twitter, he also has a YouTube channel under the same name, Top Gyms in Las Vegas, the top boxing gyms in Las Vegas, Michael.
I think, I'm with you. I like Mayweather's gym. There's a lot of young prospects in there. Guys coming up. Again, it comes down to sparring. Now, Floyd, back when he was running things, he wouldn't let you sit in and watch sparring. He wouldn't let you film it. But, you hear stories, even with his uncle and his father and the sparring sessions with those guys, it's the stuff of legends. So they call it, the dog pounder. You go in there and you're gonna have to earn your respect. And, it's supposed to be 3-minute rounds. Well, sometimes there's no bell, and you might go 20 minutes for a round. So there's some stuff going on in there that I think, it's sharpening up young fighters. The skill set that's taught in that gym is among the highest caliber.
Who is the most powerful man in boxing, Michael, who is not a boxer? I haven't prepped Michael for this question, but who holds the most power in boxing today?
That is not a boxer. Wow. It depends. Are we talking globally or are we talking in the United States?
Let's talk globally. It's a world sport, right?
Well, there's a promoter in Russia. His last name is Rubinsky. He's a billionaire, and he's obviously the wealthiest. Mauricio Suleiman of the WBC, which is one of the sanctioning organizations out of Mexico, he's extraordinarily powerful and wealthy as well. So there's different people who pull the strings in different ways. Boxing is kind of this mashup of a bunch of different little business groups working together loosely, and they're all loosely affiliated. In America, I would say, somebody like Bob Arum, who's a promoter, a lawyer by trade, but is the longest running promoter of all the American promoters. I still think he's a powerhouse. Even he's got to be going up in his 70s, 80s, and he's still doing really, really great things. And he's kind of been among the leading edge of American promoters getting international talent. He was one of the first who really started signing Latin American fighters. In recent years, he has expanded over into Asia. He started doing cards in Macau, and he's expanding that market. He just signed an Australian heavyweight, Joseph Parker, who has a heavyweight title right now. Bob Arum just signed an Irish Olympian, Michael Conlon, who made his pro debut last Friday in New York on St. Patrick's Day in front of a sold-out Madison Square Garden theater. This was a pro debut for a kid who just got out of the Olympics, and thousands of Irish people flew across the pond to see a pro debut, to see a fight that they had to know was only going to go a few rounds. It was not an empty seat in the house. So Bob Arum is still doing his thing, and I would say in all of American boxing, he's the most powerful guy, and in the world, he's one of the most powerful still.
That's the voice of Michael Montero. I'm John Kelly alongside Vern Vivio. You're listening to the EOG Sports Hour basketball talk to come the second half of the program. We're talking boxing right now to a man who knows the sport. Also in studio with us tonight, Hoboken Pete. He's a lifelong devotee of boxing. We'll talk to Pete in one moment. Optimistic or pessimistic, Michael, about the future of the game? Pete has some ideas on how to promote the game and where the game has been and where the game is going. What are your thoughts about the future of boxing? Michael, are you optimistic or pessimistic about its future?
Well, I guess that depends on which day of the week you ask me. Boxing, it never ceases to shoot itself in the foot, at least in the United States. But there's a lot of promise. It's the sport is changing, and it's the future of the sport. The pay-per-view model in America, I think, has to be adjusted. I think if you look at what they do in the United Kingdom, they have platforms set up where they have cable packages. Sky Sports is basically their ESPN over there. They have other networks like Box Nation and such where there's regular boxing programming on TV. And they show not just the bigger international fights, but they show a lot of local fights. They build up the local fighters there among the UK fans. And then when they get to that pay-per-view level, the pay-per-view cards over there are 17 pounds or, about $20 American. And then on top of that, instead of only having 2 or 3 undercard fights, they show the entire cards. You're getting 4 or 5 hours of boxing over there for $20. Over here, the casual, or I should say the diehard fan is priced out oftentimes because these pay-per-views are $60, $70, $80. And then when you go to the commercial outlets like a small casino or a bar, the licensing fees to put on these pay-per-views can be $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. It's just too much. You compare that to what the UFC does, where they charge 1/10 of that to a bar. The bar can afford to put on a UFC card and not charge a cover. So they get people coming in and ordering drinks and watching the fight, and the sport grows. I just think the model that worked for boxing in the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s, and really maybe up until the end of the Floyd Mayweather era, that is gone. They have to adjust to the 21st century. I think they're starting to experiment with streaming technologies for the pay-per-views. I think that's very important. That's where the future of the business is. What we don't know yet is how many fans are skipping the pay-per-view. They're not ordering it on TV, but rather they're getting it on Facebook Live with their friends. We don't have the numbers yet. The technology is being developed. But the estimates are that there are millions of fans watching these pay-per-view cards for free on their cell phone on Facebook Live and streaming services like that. So I just think that the platform needs to be updated for the 21st century. The talent's there. The fighters just have to fight each other. You talk about Golovkin and Jacobs, the fight I covered last Saturday in Madison Square Garden. There were almost 20,000 fans there. It was a near-capacity crowd, and it was a cold week where there had been a blizzard. So a lot of people braved the cold to go to that fight. It was almost a sellout. It was an exciting atmosphere. And the night before, there was a sellout for Michael Conlan's pro debut. So people are responding and going to the fights. It's just the pay-per-view model has to change.
Well, Michael, welcome aboard. I love listening to you on YouTube and everything. We have Hoboken Pete here, and Hoboken Pete, welcome to the show. Hoboken Pete's got some tremendous ideas. I want you to stay on the line and listen to some of Hoboken's ideas to improve boxing. Go ahead, Hoboken.
Well, the problem is we got to get rid of these alphabet soups. I don't even know who the champions are today. There's 26,000 champions. We got to get back to the old days where we have 8 world champions and we can have 8 junior champions. When I grew up in the 50s, my grandmother Garoni, she knew who Sugar Ray Robinson was, that he was the middleweight champ. Marciano was the heavyweight champ. Today, nobody knows who's the champ. I don't even know who's the champion. And I also think we should take Teddy Atlas and make him the national commissioner. The commissioner of all the states in the United States, almost like in a Dana White situation. I think Teddy would be perfect for the job. We should have mandatory title fights within 6 months. You got to fight the number one contender. This fight on May the 6th with Chavez and Canelo, that's a joke. That should be Chavez. That should be Canelo and Triple G. If the fight happens to be a good fight, they can have another one in November. The boxing is in the toilet. That's my opinion.
Michael Montero, your reaction to what Hoboken Pete said?
Wow, there's a lot to respond to there. Hoboken Pete, I agree with you regarding the super and junior divisions. You know, if you go back, there used to be, welterweight cut off at 147 pounds and middleweight was 160 pounds. And for fighters that wanted to fight for multiple titles, like Henry Armstrong, let's say, he had to move up all 13 pounds, right? Mm-hmm. Then they started doing what they called catchweight fights, which they still do, but the original catchweights were in between, let's say, welterweight and middleweight. Then the sanctioning body said, well, we're getting some of these catchweight fights. Let's just make a new division. Let's call it junior middleweight, 154 pounds right in the middle. Boom. And then they started doing that for all of them. Now, I agree with you. If overnight we got rid of the junior and super divisions, the talent pool would double or triple in each of the divisions. I think it'd be stacked. The problem is this sport is so global. You talked about the sanctioning organizations, and there are 4 major ones, and there used to only be one major organization, right? It was the WBA, but historically it was the NBA, the National Boxing Association. But it's such a global sport. This sport used to be centered solely in America. As it expanded globally now, you can't manage it with one entity. You talk about the UFC. That's basically an American league for mixed martial arts. Now, I know they have fighters from different parts of the world, but the overwhelming majority are American, or at least from North America, and the base of operations is here. So there's one entity controlling it. It's so much smaller than boxing. Boxing, you have registered, licensed boxers, tens of thousands of them in hundreds of countries on every continent. There's probably one on Antarctica somewhere I never heard of. They're everywhere. You can't manage it with one entity. The one thing I do think is doable, and I totally agree with you, is a federal boxing commission here in the United States. I don't know if Teddy Atlas is the guy to do it, but I know that it should probably be a panel, okay? It should be whether it's former fighters, former trainers, former promoters. There should be some medical experts there. But I think it should be a federal commission. Maybe there's an office in D.C. or something that oversees all the state commissions. The problem we have right now in American boxing is a fighter can be licensed to fight in California and fight there, live and work in California, and start showing health issues. They could have an MRI, and there could be issues with their brain or something, and they can move across the country to another commission, let's say Tennessee, and register there. And that information that the California State Athletic Commission has is not necessarily shared with the Tennessee Commission. And that fighter who's vulnerable and has health issues can get licensed and fight there and get hurt. So I agree. One federal commission, streamlined rules. If you're going to fight in America, if you're going to be licensed to fight in America, you have to abide by our rules. We can't control what goes on in Russia or China or anywhere else, but we can control what happens here. I would also support taking 1% of the purse of every championship fight held in America and putting that into a pot, a medical pot for former fighters that need health care. Because a lot of these former fighters, if you've been around enough gyms like I have, you see some of these guys who never amounted to much in their pro career. Maybe they had a career where they were 10 wins and 20 losses. They were an opponent. They end up being a trainer or helping out a gym somewhere, and they have health issues in their 40s and 50s. Boxing is a sport that, causes a lot of neurological damage, and these guys don't have health insurance. So I would support some sort of, medical plan that we could dip into. I could keep going on and on about stuff. The WBC just started their clean boxing program with VADA, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, who's headquartered there in Vegas with you guys. I just talked with Margaret Goodman, their chairman, a few weeks ago. They're instituting that the WBC is that the top 15 rated fighters in each division take year-round mandatory anti-doping tests.
What about this question? What about going back to the Ring Magazine ratings, the Bible of boxing? What about doing that? What about when you have pay-per-view fights? I go to a person's house to see fights. Nobody's watching the preliminaries. Nobody. They're watching the main event. Everybody's talking and drinking. When I go to a mixed martial arts, a UFC show at somebody's house, everybody's watching the fights. The fights are competitive. Boxing is ripping everybody off. You need 4 or 5 championship fights on the pay-per-view shows.
I agree with you. And look, that model that you're talking about with the UFC, that's what's happening right now in the UK with boxing. Eddie Hearn, who I think is the best promoter in the sport right now over in England, that's exactly what they're doing. They're doing that same model where they have their fighters on regular cable, I should say. It's not always network TV, but regular cable on a regular basis. And it's not just fights. They have boxing shows. They have analysts on there breaking down the fights. They have fighters on there doing interviews. They show training footage, right? So they promote these guys. They actually promote their fighters. And then when they do a pay-per-view, they've got 6, 7, 8 fights on there, and they're all competitive. I think the American promoters need to take a look in the mirror. The networks have a part to play here, but here's what no one's talking about. The fighters. This comes down to the fighters because they're going to have to take less money to do the things that you're asking. They're going to have to take less money. And I'm sorry, the last era we just finished up, the Floyd Mayweather-Manny Pacquiao era, it was about pulling the bait and switch, dangling a carrot in front of the fans for 6, 7 years until you can get them to buy $100 pay-per-view that was crap and then walk away with the money.
Here's the thing that the UFC does correctly. Like every Saturday, I get up, in the afternoon, and they have a pre-show. The pre-show comes on at 4:00 in the afternoon. It's on for 1 hour. They talk about all the fights that are coming up. They interview. Then they have the preliminaries. It's all on Fox Sports 1. That goes from 5:00 to 7:00. Then we got the main show. That's got 5 more fights. That goes from 7:00 to 10:00. Then they got a post show. And they explain everything and what happened, and Dana White comes on. This is what boxing needs. Boxing needs a show, a weekly show, something like the UFC. The UFC promotes 100% better than boxing.
I totally agree with you, Hoboken Pete. They totally do a much better job promoting. Eric Austin's here. He wants to ask Hoboken Pete and Mike some questions.
Hello, gentlemen. Mike and Hoboken. I think we missed a point here, though. 2 things about this issue. One, the fighters would have to take less money, and that cat might be out of the bag. But more importantly than that, we failed to acknowledge that the reason American boxing was popular was because the American champion always resided in the USA. And until we get an American heavyweight champion that resides here and gets the masses going again, boxing is going to be in the never land. I mean, people follow it because of the smaller weights, but until there's a heavyweight champ, you can't get the masses to fall in line, and you won't get the networks to promote it, or you won't get the networks to take less money because they feel like we're only going to give you 1 fight, and there's going to be 2 little guys fighting, so once a year. So there's no need to promote it when they know that this I won't say little guy, but let's say a Floyd Mayweather is only going to fight twice a year and not knock anybody out. If you think about back to the day of Mike Tyson, the reason boxing had that last run was because Tyson was knocking everyone out. The USA Network was involved. HBO was involved. Showtime was involved. CBS was involved. ABC was involved. The networks wanted to get involved because we had an American champion that was like none other. Back to Sonny Liston, George Foreman day. So if we get a heavyweight champion who can establish himself for a couple years and bring excitement to it, then all these other problems other than money would be solved in boxing.
Michael, your thoughts on what Eric said?
I think it would solve some of the problems, but it's like, look, right now we have an undefeated American heavyweight titleist from Alabama. His name is Deontay Wilder. He just had a fight, I want to say back in March, and he's got 36 some odd pro fights. I think all but 3 of his fights have ended in knockout, but you guys probably haven't seen him fight yet.
Well, we've seen him. He came to the kid from Alabama fought here in Las Vegas, Michael, and he's a very vicious fighter. He's not really a boxer. You would have to agree. He's more of a knockout artist. But him living in Alabama, I don't know if he's getting the recognition he deserves. And the heavyweight division's pretty weak. You would have to say so. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I think it was weak for the last 10 years or so, but it's actually heated up in recent years. And there's some good, athletic, big, strong prospects coming up. And the heir apparent, Anthony Joshua, undefeated kid out of London, he's probably Lennox Lewis version 2.0. He has a fight coming up in April 29th, against the former champion Vladimir Klitschko at Wembley Stadium. They've already sold 90,000 tickets to that fight. In fact, they had originally scaled it for 75,000, but they had such a demand that the promoter, Eddie Hearn, went to the city officials and asked if they could reroute the subway lines that day and the schedules to accommodate the extra 15,000. So they're expecting over 90,000 fans to watch this kid. Meanwhile, he doesn't even have 20 pro fights yet. The sport of boxing, guys, is very, very healthy. It's actually financially healthier than it's ever been on a global basis. The old guard of American boxing needs to realize it's not just an American sport anymore. It's global. It's different.
I agree with you, Mike. Hoboken Pete's got a question for you.
Let me ask you this. The UFC goes 5-minute rounds. Okay, why doesn't boxing go 4-minute rounds? That'll put the fighters in better condition. They'll train harder because the UFC trains a lot harder than the fighters. And the reason I say 4 minutes is if you ever watch these fights, when it comes to the end of the third, like coming to the end of the round with 10 seconds to go, the guy gets hurt and the bell rings. It's always the bell rings. Give the public an extra minute. And I say go back to 15 rounds. True championship distance. 15 rounds in boxing. What do you think, Michael?
Well, I think that the endurance required for boxing dwarfs MMA. And I'm not saying that to disrespect MMA. I'm saying that because I've actually trained a little bit in both. I was in the Marine Corps, and I did a little bit of jiu-jitsu and judo. I just didn't like being on the ground. I preferred boxing. But I've been to enough gyms. Being on your feet for 3 minutes is a lot. And you have to remember, okay, 12 rounds, 3 minutes apiece, that's 36 minutes. If you want to extend that to 4 minutes, now you're talking 48 minutes, and then there's a minute between each round. So you're extending a fight that's already so long. I think part of what makes MMA more popular with casual sports fans who might not necessarily understand martial arts is because it's so quick. It's designed to be, and again, I'm not saying this disrespectfully, but it's designed for a short attention span.
Mike, I want to interrupt you for 1 second. I want to go over a potential fight that's coming up. I want to do a little roundtable with all our people here. I do want to talk about this Conor McGregor potentially fighting Floyd Mayweather. We're going to start with Hoboken Pete. Do you think this would do good for boxing even if Floyd loses to Hoboken?
This would do very good for boxing. Everybody thinks that this is a joke. This is no joke. I'm not going to lay $2,000 to win $100 on Floyd. I'm going to lay $100 on McGregor to get back $900 to win $800. Conor McGregor, before he was in mixed martial arts, was a boxer. He's got the reach, he's got the height, he's got the chin, and he's like a contortionist. I've never seen anything like it. He's like a snake coming out of a capsule. I think he's going to drive Floyd nuts. He's a southpaw. I think it's 50. Usually when Floyd fights, he's got a 90% chance of winning. I think Floyd has a 50% chance of winning. I think it's a dead even fight, and I think it's going to happen.
I also agree with Hoboken Pete. I know Michael has a different perspective on that, and I respect his opinion. The only thing I want to mention to you, Mike, is the age factor. There's a 12-year age gap, and I just think that McGregor's a much stronger individual. He doesn't have the boxing skills as Floyd, but I think he's going to rough him up and try to win in an early KO. Eric's going to give his opinion on that, too.
I don't know where to begin. Michael, maybe we're on the same side and maybe we're not, but I got to disagree with my studio guest here. Floyd would dance around for 12 rounds and not let McGregor get close enough to hit him. It would be a very bad thing for boxing, because what we're not saying is boxing is not the sport where you're trying to take damage. You want to inflict damage, but you don't want to take damage. And that's why it's different than the UFC, because in the UFC, you can't win without inflicting damage. In boxing, the ideal is not to take the damage and inflict it. So if you can avoid being inflicted on, then you will always win the fight. And that's Floyd's game. He would figure out McGregor in 2 rounds and then just dance around and pity-pat him enough to make it one boring fight, one expensive fight, and a lot of people upset. But, Michael, I want to say one thing to you before they let you go. I'm not sure your age, but if you're a Detroit guy, I'm going to throw 2 names at you. Donald Motor City Curry and Thomas the Hitman Hearns. I'm sure you were upset when Hearns lost an undefeated unification fight with Sugar Ray Leonard, and I'm sure you got some Donald Corey stories from the Kronk Gym you could relate to the audience as well.
Yeah, that was my childhood, man. I was a very, very young kid.
All right, I didn't think you were 45, so I'll give you a break on Tommy Hearns and Motor City Curry. But both those guys were excellent fighters.
Oh, man, that's the old school Kronk, which, now, the last time I was in Detroit, it was a couple of years ago, I went and checked out the old Kronk. There is a new one that they opened up, but the ruins of it, man, it's really, really sad. But growing up,
you know the first rule in the Kronk gym is to hit and not be hit.
It will hurt and not be hurt.
Exactly.
That's the whole thing. This is the hurt business.
Exactly.
We would say in the amateurs it's hit and don't be hit, but in the pros it's hurt and don't be hurt.
Absolutely.
And I just backing up on what you said about Floyd, I totally agree with you, 100%. I think that one thing the UFC has done an outstanding job of is marketing, and they. Sound disrespectful to MMA. I respect the hell out of those guys. I don't care what discipline you fight in, whether it's boxing, wrestling, kickboxing. I respect all of it. But those guys do not have the footwork. They don't have the head movement. Their stance is so wide open. Boxing stance is a lot more closed off. The angles you fight at, it's 6-inch movements. It just Conor looks fast against MMA fighters. He takes a punch well against MMA fighters. He lands accuracy. Doing it against Floyd Mayweather is a different animal. And I agree with you guys. Floyd is a lot older. There has been some wear and tear. He's been working out in the gym for decades now, since he was basically in diapers. So there's always a chance McGregor could land something out of left field and get lucky. But that's 1% out of 100. 99% says Floyd slaps him around, mauls him, holds him on the ropes, spins him off, slaps him some more, and does that for 12 rounds in a boring money grab, just like he did with Pacquiao.
I agree with you 1,000%, Michael. I want to add this point, though. Being in Vegas and been here for a long time, I follow the UFC. The UFC is basically 2 guys, when they're on stand-up fighting, 2 guys fighting in the street. One guy's got a little better jab. The other guy throws power punches. They think they have an understanding of boxing, so they can hold their hands together and throw punches, but they're not boxers. And that's the difference between UFC strikers and professional boxers. Professional boxers box. They understand how to put their head in, how to pull it out, how to throw a hook, how to throw a jab, and more importantly, as you said, footwork. How to get in and out, how to plant down and throw power shots, be it hooks to the body, hooks to the head, right crosses, what have you. MMA guys can throw power punches, but they're not watching boxers and saying, "Okay, this is how I'm going to strike."
Well, I'll tell you what. Floyd better switch to southpaw, because that left shoulder that protects his chin. Conor's radar left hand is coming over the right shoulder. So if I was Floyd, I would switch around and jab. Because I'm telling you, man, this is going to be a good fight. It's going to be an excellent fight.
Well, Mike, our last question for you tonight is, I'm a Tommy Hearns fan like yourself. When he fought Marvelous Marvin Hagler, would you say that's been the greatest championship fight in 3 rounds that you ever seen in your career?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say that 3 rounds. And the thing is, that first round, Name a fight, any fight, and I'll include UFC in this, where two guys went at it like that in the first round. There was no feeling out process. It was just savagery. But here's the thing: there were skills. There were skills and craft along with the savagery, and that's what made it so beautiful. That's what separated it from other fights and other sports. That was just boxing at its best.
Michael Montero, thanks for joining us on tonight's program. Last question from me before you leave. A best source for information on the sport of boxing. I like to visit several websites, including the sweetscience.com. We have a journalist here in Las Vegas, Arnie K. Lang. He's been around a long time. He's editor-in-chief of the Sweet Science. He's a boxing historian of note. Where do you go for your information, Michael?
Well, I go to myself, but if I could plug my stuff again, Montero on Boxing, my YouTube channel, check that out. But I write for Boxing Monthly magazine. It's a British magazine. We have a website. We have writers from all over the world. That's an outstanding place to go for information. I also work with the Undisputed Champion Network. That's a YouTube channel and a website. I just penned an article for them on their website a couple days ago about the great fights we've had in the first quarter of 2017. 2017, this year of boxing, is probably going to be the best in at least a decade if the fights keep coming off the way they have been. It's been a great, great year. So go to UCN Live. That's their website. But BoxingMonthly.com, UCNLive.com. Of course, check out my stuff, Montero on Boxing. And I do videos, I write, I do a little bit of everything. So find me on Twitter and we'll debate some more.
Last question. How about a prediction if Canelo Alvarez and Triple G get in the ring later this year? Who wins an Alvarez-Golovkin fight?
I think that's an absolutely interesting, compelling fight. It's going to be everything that Mayweather-Pacquiao wasn't. And Canelo has to get by Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. first, and that's actually going to be a closer fight than people think. That's going to be a tough challenge. If he can get past that, and Golovkin's probably going to fight in Kazakhstan for the fourth middleweight title. He's going to unify all the titles against a British fighter named Billy Joe Saunders. If they both come out of those fights successful, they should fight in September. I like Golovkin in that fight. I just think he has more levels. But I actually think it's going to be very, very close and competitive and probably go the distance. And I could see a 7 rounds to 5 kind of win with a couple of knockdowns possibly in that fight.
Michael Montero, thanks for the time. We'll chat with you down the road. Again, at Montero on Boxing, his Twitter handle and YouTube channel. Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Let's do it again.
We will. Michael Montero on the program. Excellent recruit from Vern Vivio. Hoboken